Get ready to go whenever you're ready.
All right, we're almost ready to start. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let me start this meeting. I had a briefing with the chief this morning that went on, which is got me late to room 412, so I apologize for that.
No worries. Police chief?
Yes, it was a monthly briefing, so it wasn't like there was some urgent crisis, but top of mind for him is the criminal code revision. And so about 3/4 of our time was spent with him speaking to his concerns. At any rate, let me start this meeting or hearing so that we can hear from you. I'm calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, October 27, 2022. The time is 10:32 in the morning, and this hearing is being conducted virtually live via the Zoom video conference broadcast platform. I believe it's also streaming on the council's website. In any event, it will be available on the council's website, which is www.dccouncil.gov. And it is also live via the chairman's website, which is www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. The subject of this morning's hearing is Bill 24-939, Repeal of Outdated and Unnecessary Audit Mandates Amendment Act of 2022. This legislation was introduced by me. And although it doesn't say this, it was pretty much at the request of the auditor on July 13th, 2022. The stated purpose of Bill 24-939 is to repeal outdated and unnecessary mandates for audits and other reports required of the Office of the District of Columbia Auditor. The auditor supports the Council of the District of Columbia by reviewing and auditing the accounts of district agencies and making recommendations to the council regarding the economy, efficiency, and accountability of the district government. The auditor is currently required to complete at least 12 statutory audits each year. Some of the statutes requiring these audits date back to before the Home Rule Act. That's the Home Rule Act of 1973. And before the creation of the Chief Financial Officer in 1995. As a result, many of the statutory audits performed by the auditor are no longer necessary or duplicative of other reviews or audits. I will add that the auditor, Kathy Patterson, has been quite aggressive about pursuing different topics for analysis or reporting or audit. And we're seeing many more audits coming out of that office. When I say audits, I've used that term broadly, including reports, than we've seen in the past. And that does change the context in which the council may have thought we needed to mandate audits or reports in the law. We'll get a fuller explanation of this from the auditor when she testifies. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on November 10th, 2022. We're nearing the end of council period 24, and it is our intent that this bill would move to markup so that it could get 2 readings before the end of the council period. So anyone who has concerns should express them ideally in writing. If it's not in writing, it's not going to be included in the record before 5 p.m. on November 10th, 2022. We have the notice of this hearing was published easily 2 weeks ago. I'm going to say maybe a month ago, 6 weeks ago. We have one witness, and that is the District of Columbia Auditor, Kathy Patterson. I have your statement. So if you want to read all of it, that's fine. I'm not asking you not to. There aren't a lot of other witnesses, so the morning is yours, although we do have another hearing that will follow this. So begin when you want.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and I am Kathy Patterson. I appreciate the chance to discuss this legislation, and I thank you very much for introducing the bill. And I will read not some, but not all of the statement. By way of background, when I was confirmed for this position in November 2014, the committee's report on the resolution described the agency's original mission, challenges then facing the Office of the DC Auditor, and the evolving role of our national counterpart, the U.S. Government Accountability Office. If anything, the report noted, the Auditor's Office has fallen short of both its original mandate and the expanded mission of its model, the GAO. The committee report cited a 2010 transition team report for then incoming Council Chairman Kwame Brown on shortcomings of the Auditor's Office, including the failure to focus on the most important issues facing the district. That failure was attributed in part to statutory requirements that no longer represented the Council's policy priorities. Since that time, this committee and the full Council have taken action to support the office by eliminating low priority mandated responsibilities that were not consistent with the original and evolving mission of the agency. In 2016, 2 such bills were enacted. One, the Advisory Neighborhood Commission's Omnibus Amendment Act gave significantly more authority to the Office of Advisory Neighborhood Commissions and removed many of our responsibilities that had been ministerial in nature and not really consistent with the role of an audit agency. That same year, the Council enacted similar legislation to what's before us today to eliminate or amend several audit mandates. As a result of these steps taken by the Council, we've had an opportunity to focus our resources on such high priority matters as the performance of the Housing Production Trust Fund, shortcomings of the Office of Unified Communications 911 operations, and lead mitigation efforts at properties of the DC Housing Authority, among many others. In the last 2.5 years, we have had sufficient resources and flexibility to research and publish 8 reports to assist the district in understanding and mitigating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The bill before you today will continue that effort to assist ODCA in focusing on the highest priority issues. I will focus on what's in the bill as introduced and then touch on a couple potential additional provisions. Several measures in the bill would remove from the code requirements for audits that have already been completed. These include an audit of the Fair Elections Program for the election cycle ending November 3rd, 2020, which report was published earlier this year. A requirement that we audit the Office of Out-of-School Time Grants and Youth Outcomes within 2 years of the office's issuance of its first grants, which was completed in May 2020. That law also requires audits every 5 years, and we're recommending eliminating that requirement. Another one-time audit requirement was to look at the impact of cuts in public assistance in 2013, which was met with a report in May of 2014. Another requirement for evaluations of the Summer Youth Employment Program, which we met by publishing 4 reports in 2016 and 2017. Another required audit on the Ban the Box legislation, which we published in June 16. Another one that's a little more complicated was a requirement that we, on behalf of the Council, contract with the National Academy of Sciences for an evaluation of education reform efforts following the 2007 legislation transferring oversight of schools to the mayor. That report was completed in 2015 with a major report issued by the National Research Council of the National Academies. We have fulfilled our requirement, which the legislation would acknowledge, but I also note there remains in the code a more general requirement for an annual evaluation of DC public schools, quote, and of any affiliated education reform efforts. To my knowledge, no subsequent evaluation has been conducted, and the law doesn't assign responsibility to any entity for meeting that requirement. There are also provisions in the legislation to eliminate what we have determined are either unnecessary or low priority requirements. One requires ODCA to audit select performance measures every year, but assessing agency performance is the majority of the work that we do. So a specific audit on performance measures is unnecessary. That provision also requires the district government agencies that they all consult with ODCA in developing performance plans and reports, it's a requirement that's never been met to my knowledge and may come as a huge surprise to the Office of the City Administrator, which manages the executive branch's annual performance planning process. Another one that we have deemed not as high a priority is that ODCA may conduct random audits of the Department of Small and Local Business Development certification files, which again is unnecessary since we have the authority to do so. We're also required to look at a selection of privatization contracts, but we have authority and discretion to conduct that without the mandate. And in addition, to the best of my knowledge, the Office of Contracting and Procurement has not entered into any such contract since the council enacted this requirement. Another code provision requires the Department of Health to have regular evaluations of the Healthcare Ombudsman Program and says they may select ODCA, but they never have done so. And we believe this would be a kind of a conflict with our auditing responsibilities if someone invited us in to conduct such an audit. There's also a requirement of conducting accounts and transactions having to do with the Office of Lottery and Gaming, but they're also required to separately conduct their own comprehensive independent financial audit. We're also required to audit the Real Property Tax Appeals Commission every 3 years, and we believe this should be at our discretion rather than every 3 years. And I would note that the audits we've done on this agency during my tenure have shown that what was once a very troubled district government operation has improved significantly, and recommendations made by the audits have been adopted. Similarly, we're now required to audit the Public Vehicles for Hire Consumer Service Fund every 3 years, which it does appear to be a low priority issue and a topic that we have the discretion to return to if we believe it's necessary. There are a couple of other provisions that don't fit neatly either into the outdated or unnecessary category, and I'll touch on them separately. There's a contracting provision that makes clear that ODCA and the Office of the Inspector General have access to the books and records of a district government contractor or any subcontractor where those books and records related to the performance of the contract. But for some reason that we could not ascertain, this provision precludes access to firm fixed price contracts. The current code section also requires that contractors maintain records for 3 years. The legislation we've recommended would delete the exclusion of firm fixed price contracts from this and increase the duration of the maintenance of records to 7 years to be consistent with our other district retention practices. The district's First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act of 2004 included a requirement that the DC auditor review Metropolitan Police Department investigations of First Amendment activities, a provision that was designed to ensure appropriate authorization of any undercover surveillance of political organizations. Today, however, the department follows the activities of such organizations that are planning events in the district primarily through social media, rather than what we deemed at the time, the council deemed at the time, to be more intrusive undercover surveillance, and which had been identified as a concern in the earlier legislation. So we're recommending deleting that provision. We're again recommending repealing the current mandate for annual audits of the school modernization program. Since 2014, we've issued 7 school modernization audit reports and have 2 additional reports nearing completion, both focused, as you know, Mr. Chairman, on the final stages of the modernization program when projects are turned over to the Department of General Services for maintenance. While we have devoted extensive resources to these audits and have aimed to meet the intent and purpose of the law, and yet it's very difficult to meet the specific statutory requirement, as we've noted in our reports, because the school system does not operate in a manner consistent with the requirement. The code requires that we conduct a school and project-specific audit of all expenditures for facility capital improvements. And yet, as you know, in the capital improvement plan, the school system does not allocate all of its dollars to individual schools. Each year, the council approves that program with sections devoted to such things as roof repairs or HVAC repairs not allocated to individual school. So what I would recommend is going forward and deleting this requirement. And if it is the council's view that a school modernization audit mandate continues, I would suggest that you repeal the current code provision, and then in the new council period, we could work with committee leaders with oversight for public education and DGS to come up with a requirement that would reflect the lessons that are yet to be learned from school construction audits. Mr. Chairman, I'd mentioned one additional provision I request be considered for the legislation, and two others you might want to consider now or in the future. And the first concerns our agency fiscal officer. This is an issue that I addressed in a letter to the council on September 30th. And I suggest the committee include the recommended amendment to the DC code to ensure that the DC auditor retains the ability to hire and supervise our agency fiscal officer. This is something that I believe would be consistent with our responsibilities, and I would ask that you consider adding this to the legislation. There's another provision that we considered internally in my agency that I am not prepared to recommend at this time, but look forward to doing so in the next council period. And that has to do with exempting audit work papers from public disclosure. A significant number of state audit offices exempt audit work papers from documents that are subject to state disclosure laws, including state versions of the Federal Freedom of Information Act. In some instances, the documents are exempt on a permanent basis, and in other states exempt them for the duration of an audit. We are interested in such an exemption in order to enhance protections for those individuals who come to us as whistleblowers and want to provide information, but also seek confidentiality. And I hope to provide a recommendation along these lines to the council in the next council period. Finally, we have provided recommendations to the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety on language that would authorize a deputy auditor for public safety. And I mention this in today's context since the provision that you proposed in Bill 24036, the Strengthening Oversight and Accountability of Police Amendment Act of 2021, would amend a code section pertaining to the Office of the DC Auditor and could be made a part of the pending legislation before this committee. The council has already provided funding in support of the deputy auditor position, as you well know, Mr. Chairman, and we're in the process of moving into new lease space that includes office space for the anticipated new unit. That concludes my testimony, Mr. Chairman, and I'm including in this testimony a chart that outlines each provision as introduced and a red line version of the legislation that includes two minor corrections and the additional provision that I described. That concludes my statement, and I'm happy to respond to questions.
I came into the hearing room with 3, and I think I have more. So I now have more. In 2016, the council adopted the Procurement Integrity, Transparency, and Accountability Amendment Act of 2016. This law added a new reporting requirement for the auditor with respect to government privatization contracts. You spoke to that in your testimony. I think we may have worked with you on this provision at the time. I think. So we included it then. Again, I think we worked with you. Now you're recommending it be taken out. Do the low number of new privatization contracts, I think your statement said 0, entered into by the district contribute to your assessment that such audits should be discretionary?
That's correct. And again, what we typically do, and it's not an extraordinary expenditure of time, but what we typically do is a letter to the chief procurement officer to say, have you entered into any such contracts? And then bug them to answer that letter. And then they answer the letter and say, no, we haven't. I mean, that's not a huge expenditure of time, but it's something that we would be happy to dispense with, and then be on the lookout for any privatization contracts that come through the council. And if you and others on the council think that there are things that we should take a look at after the fact, then we certainly could do that.
Earlier this year, we had a contract on streetlights, which the mayor described as a public-private partnership. I'm not sure if that's quite the same as privatization. I'll say it is. Did you do an audit on that?
No, that's not. What's in the law requires anything that's new any new privatization contracts. So for example, it doesn't cover something like the school food services contract because that's been privatized for some years now. I don't believe, I mean, we've had our streetlights, we've had contracts done for streetlight maintenance for a long time. So it may be that would not be deemed covered by the law.
So your reading of the statute, which I don't have in front of me, is if we've had, I'll use the example of food service, if we've had contracts for outside non-government entities to do food service in our schools, the fact that we're changing who that is
Would not be covered.
would not be covered because it's a new contract, but it's not new that it's been privatized.
Right. I believe your focus at the time, if I recall correctly, was when we take a major government service and hand it to the private sector. And what some of the other provisions of the law we're looking at, I believe, was trying to define what is an inherently government service. That was another part of the law, so that when something is determined not to be an inherently government service, that's the point when the audit requirement would kick in. I have to say, Mr. Chairman, if you needed to drop something from this bill, this would probably be top of my list to not include in the legislation because it's not an onerous expenditure of time. But I also agree with you, just as a matter of policy, that it is very important if the government determines that something is no longer an inherently governmental function.
Yeah. Access to contractor records. You spoke to that. This is the fixed firm price. The
Yeah,
law currently written gives the auditor and OIG access to all contractor records except for records on firm fixed price contracts. Why was this exclusion in the PPRA? That's the 2010 Act. And what information would you get with the expanded authority?
one of the issues here, and again, we were not able to find in the record on that legislation, we weren't able to find why that exclusion was included. So I don't know what the council's reasoning was at the time. And I also think that it's arguable that our authority would permit us to go after that. I mean, I think it's at least arguable that our authority in a different part of the code, unless there's some language that says, other provisions be disregarded here, I think it's at least arguable that we could look at those contracts because our authority is so broad. But what we're suggesting is that we clear that up to make sure to take that out so that we can get at any contract information.
Yeah, let's be clear. We're not talking about looking at the contract. We're talking about looking at the books and records of the contractor.
Pertaining to the contract, right?
Yes.
Not looking at a company's other contracts.
Correct. You have under your I don't know what to call it. No, what's your Establishment Act?
Right.
Huh? Well, I'm looking at Evan Cash. It's the Home Rule Act that
Right.
sets out your broad authority.
Right, and the most important word in it is the word all. That all things pertaining to the district government.
Yes, you have very broad authority to have access. Arguably, that doesn't pertain to the private sector. I don't know that I want to concede that, and I don't want you to concede that. And you just said, though, arguably, that you have that authority.
When district dollars go to that private sector entity, right?
Yes.
And I believe our contracts, generally speaking, may make reference to accessibility of documents that support the payment of the district dollars to the contractor. I believe there is language in most contracts or in standard contracts that provide what I would call an audit trail. It's not called an audit trail in the contract, but I think I believe that's the case just based on conversations we've had in the course of some training earlier this week.
So what's going through my mind is this. No question you have access if it's a government agency. One could argue that if it's a private company, even though it's district dollars, that you don't have access. I'm assuming that's why the law makes clear that you have access to the books and records of a district government contractor. And so then it would make sense to have that pertain to all contracts, including fixed price contracts. The question is just why those were excluded. You don't know why.
I don't.
And I'm assuming that you looked at the legislative record, including the committee report, which probably didn't say why. But the other part of your testimony is recommending deletion of the recommending that increasing the duration of record maintenance from 3 to 7 years. That gives me a little pause. I get why you would want 7 years, but what we're doing is we're saying to a non-government entity, this would pertain to contracts that have already taken place or current contracts, that they have to keep them for not 3 years, but 7 years, and they may not know. I have some hesitation there. How long do you know how long the, for IRS purposes, a company is required to keep its records?
I don't offhand. I just know that the district's own record retention policies are 7 years. So for example, going back to the school food services contract, DCPS would be required to keep all the contract documentation for 7 years. And this would apply that same requirement to the contractor side. And I think that's something that could in fact be written into the contracts if your concern is, generally speaking, is the contractor being aware of requirements. If it were part of the contract itself, presumably contracts today say retain for 3 years, and it would simply be a matter of changing it to 7.
Well, I think this may be more on me, but if you want to volunteer, that we talk to Office of Contracting and Procurement to get their view of whether it's okay to extend it to 7 years. I think I'm also interested in knowing how long the IRS requires that a company keep records. So if they require you keep records for 5 years, I don't know that I'd have a problem with saying, well, then contractors have to keep their records for 5 years. But if we're
I keep my records for 7 years. I thought that was the IRS requirement, but I haven't looked at it lately.
So I think I want to know a little bit more because I'm uneasy about just imposing that burden without understanding the broader context. And also, I think we would want it to be applicable to new contracts.
That would make sense.
With regard to the First Amendment activities, this requirement for an annual audit was created by legislation that came out of the Judiciary Committee. You may have some familiarity with that.
Yes, I have great familiarity with it.
What I'm actually trying to say is you wrote that language.
I did, but not the ODCA provision. The ODCA provision was an amendment. I believe it was an Ambrose amendment. But written by then staff and former council member, David Grosso, but it was not in the committee print.
And I'll bet that you accepted it as friendly on the dais.
Yes.
Okay, so one of your focuses as auditor has been on these sorts of audits, and you mentioned in your testimony that MPD has been in compliance for years. Are you confident that the issue has been addressed comprehensively enough that an annual audit in the future wouldn't be necessary?
I don't think the provision as it currently exists provides any value, because what was envisioned was making sure that the police department dotted its I's and crossed its T's when it sent an undercover officer to a planning meeting for a rally with the concerns that there could be discussion of potential violence at the meeting of the organization. But the police department basically doesn't do that sort of thing much anymore, because they, if you're going to have a rally, you put it out on Twitter and you put it out on Facebook. And so they simply track the social media. But the other issue is that where there have been police practices that have been challenged in litigation, they have not come under the rubric of First Amendment activities. The police department has sometimes characterized things as terrorism, anti-terrorism. And so I think this is an area of the law and of practice that needs to be reviewed to see if there's anything that we should be requiring of MPD in that in sort of a new and current context. And one of the things that I have had in mind as we propose this deletion or this change is that this be a subject for consideration by a new deputy auditor for public safety, assuming that legislation goes forward and we create that position. Because I don't want to simply like leave aside the issue of surveillance and making sure that everything is done properly. It's just that the way this was written and why it was written, they simply do it a different way today, and it's a way that is, you know, sort of publicly available.
So an area to look at with the new deputy auditor, but the current provision doesn't have a lot of value, and so what it was, and things have changed such that what it was trying to get at isn't as much of a concern.
Right, right.
In your testimony, you sort of distinguish, you do distinguish between outdated and unnecessary. On the outdated, why do we even waste the ink to get rid of an audit requirement for an audit due November 3rd, 2020 that's been done?
I think it's really just a matter of cleaning up the code so there are no extraneous provisions. It's really more of a cleanup rather than a changing it doesn't change anything. It just, as I understand it, you would see if you go into, if you go into the code, you'd see repealed instead of the language of the provision.
So what's of greater importance are the unnecessary audits.
Or one, right.
What's that?
Yes, I agree.
And so of those, I wanted to ask about a couple, which might mean more than two. You talk about a code provision requiring the Department of Health to obtain regular evaluations of the Healthcare Ombudsman Program, and states that the Department of Health may select ODCA to perform the evaluation. It seems to me that language is necessary to give you the authority to say yes if they ask. And my take on this is they've never asked, and so you're saying let's just get rid of this.
Well, they've never asked, but I also, if they did ask, I would like to say no, because it's a question about auditor independence. If they can seek us out, that may imply, that they're looking for a particular kind of an answer. It's sort of the same thinking that we made some of the changes in the ANC requirements, that we can't go in and audit something if we've had a hand in its operation. So if we were to be invited by an agency to look at their program, that can be seen as an impingement on our independence.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I'm not familiar with that provision having been written, but I would think, or it strikes me that what it's about is that the council wants that there be regular evaluations of the Healthcare Ombudsman Program. And if we really want an honest evaluation, rather than have the executive branch do the evaluation, we'll go to a different branch of government. You are independent. Certainly.
Right, and if that were an audit mandate, I would not have the same objection, because if the council mandated that we audit the ombudsman program, that's not then the agency inviting us to do so.
And you think you're compromised by the agency inviting you to do so.
Right. I can probably dig up some Gagas language and share that with you to make that point.
But how does that compromise your independence?
There's sort of an implicit buy-in that they want us to do this for a particular reason. I mean, it doesn't mean there is bias. It doesn't mean that. It's just, potentially a perception that if an agency reaches out and wants us to take a look at something, we would have to work into some kind of an agreement. There could be an MOU, and we'd have to work into the MOU language that says And this, we don't give up any of our independence. We're not going to pull any punches. We'll only do this so long as we have full access to this, that, and the other thing. So we would need to be very, very clear if they did invite us that we were going to maintain our independence and not lose any of the stature that we have as a GAGAS agency.
I'm going to jump ahead to the school modernization audits. The law requires that you do annual audits. And you would like that repealed. You're doing an audit right now of Roosevelt.
Right.
And that's not within this mandate of doing these annual audits. That's in addition to.
I believe we are considering it an audit done within to meet the intent of the law of knowing more about school modernization and what happens with school modernization.
I'm not questioning whether the authority to do the audit. I'm not sure I'm questioning anything here. It's that if you have if you're required to do an annual audit, is the Roosevelt your annual audit, or it's?
Yes, it's one of them. Yeah.
Your argument would be that you can do the Roosevelt audit without this annual mandate.
Right. And it's also a matter that we have expended a great amount of resources because of this requirement. And my thinking would be, I hope they've been useful and important audits, but I'm not sure that we're getting as much value as we could from the time expended, because the third one that we did or the fourth one that we did on my tenure started to feel somewhat similar. That's one of the reasons we looked at Roosevelt and the handoff. That's not really about modernization. It's really about what happens when you're finished and you do the handoff, because we were trying to provide new and additional information. And that's why I think the current language in the law, we're not meeting the current letter of the law in a couple of respects, because we can't audit what doesn't exist. We can't audit, school by school HVAC because they don't provide that information. And my point being, I think if you want an ongoing school modernization requirement, I think we could come up with language that would require new information to come to the council rather than sort of going over some of the same ground we've gone before.
You lost me in that very last part. It would involve new information coming to the council.
Well, I mean, what the question I would want to pose to lawmakers would be, what do you not know enough about that you would want us to work on? Because we've done 7, 8, or 8 of these reports in my tenure, and I feel like we've sort of exhausted the information that we can share. We could come up with probably the same findings on a different school. If we did the same thing we did at another high school that we did on the Duke Ellington school, for example, we would probably come up with some of the same findings. But would that be really adding to the knowledge that the oversight committees have when we've already sort of done that?
Yeah, the other side of it is that we're spending how many hundreds of millions of dollars a year on these schools?
Right, and you will find every single one of them. You will find in LIMS that every single school modernization has started out with one guaranteed maximum price and has ended up with another guaranteed maximum price. And we have recommended time and time again that the way of doing business be looked into. So if we do another audit of another school modernization, we will say it started out with a maximum price of 20 million, and at the end of the day it was 40 million. I'm not sure we've added any new information.
Yeah, I get the point. I don't know that I would disagree with you on that. But it's so much money. And there are questions about whether the school modernization is being done efficiently. Efficiently meaning that we're paying the dollars we should be paying for value to get a value and no more. And it's, I mean, I guess I could ask the question this way. So we repeal the mandate. How do we know that these huge expenditures of money will still be looked at? Your answer would be, well, of course you will. I think I'm just turning it over in my mind. I do have to say, though, that the last part of your statement here, which is that you would suggest repealing the current code provision, and then the new council period, the council could figure out what it wants to do. I mean, that's what the purpose of this hearing is and this legislation is to figure out what we want to do. I will move on.
But I would just add, one of the things we are trying to do a better job of is staying in closer touch with the council, with sort of annual sort of touching base with offices, touching base with staff. As we're developing our work plan, we try to do some outreach to say, what is it you want us to be working on? So if there is a particular aspect of school modernization work that you would like us to take a look at, we're always open to that, whether without legislation, whether without statutory requirements.
Yeah. Well, and that's important. And I'm not aware that council members have reached out to you. I know I've reached out to you. I'm not aware that council members have reached out to you and you've said no with regard to, not been responsive with regard to a request to look at something. Let me move on to the FOIA. You're not proposing anything with this legislation on FOIA.
No, we hope to be further along in being able to propose language, but we're simply not there. I want to know more about what other states do. I'm not quite sure why so many states have an exemption during the course of an audit, but then the exemption goes away once the report's published. I don't quite understand why that is, but so we have more work to do there. And I was just flagging this as something that we were looking at.
Has this been an issue for you?
It has not been a practice. Let me put that a different way. It has been an issue for individuals who have come to us and wanted to share information and want our assurance of confidentiality. And we have, in the main, provided assurance of confidentiality, but we're a little bit concerned with whether we would be able to enforce that down the road. But we haven't gotten to that place in the road.
Because there are protections such as whistleblower protections and
right, and it's documents that we want protected. But again, as I say, I'm not at a point where I can say we would like this and this kind of language. It's just something we're trying to explore.
Yeah, and I'm open to looking at that when you have a proposal.
Thank you.
The last question I had that comes from your statement is about the deputy auditor for public safety. As I read what you're saying, if the other legislation isn't going to move, then we could put it in this bill.
I am aware that the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety has an enormous amount of work before it right now, with the criminal code having been just marked up yesterday. But also all these other bills that are pending. So it was really just a suggestion that if this is something that you wanted to see move forward this council period, this would be one way to do it.
And I appreciate that. I will talk with Councilmember Allen again, but every time I've talked with him, he's indicated that that bill will move forward. I think he's looking to collapse it into a larger bill on, I'm going to call it police reform, and I'll double check with him. But if he's moving it forward, I may not.
No, and that's fine.
And if he doesn't move it forward, but I think he will, but if he doesn't, then I absolutely will look at this legislation as the vehicle.
Thank you.
Let me check with staff, see if there's any question I didn't bring up. I don't have any further questions. Let me just remind everyone, the record's open for 2 weeks. The record will close at 5 p.m. on November 10th. And we are looking to move this legislation either later in November or in December, in any event, to get this legislation to the council, this council period.
Thank you. And issues where you said you would like additional information, we'll try to provide that.
Okay, thank you. Well, and the information you provided to date has been helpful. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your service. This has been a hearing on Bill 24-939, Repeal of Outdated and Unnecessary Audit Mandates Amendment Act of 2022. After I adjourn this hearing, we have a second hearing, which will start in about, I'm going to say 5 minutes from now. The time is 11:15 and this hearing is adjourned.